What if depression isn't actually the problem, but merely a symptom that is pointing to something deeper? Welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. I'm your host, Paul F. Austin, and today we're talking about how we can heal mental health challenges. The medical system that typically focuses on managing symptoms rather than addressing root causes and exploring what happens when we approach these challenges from a completely different paradigm. Today's guest is Dr. Katelyn Kalstein, a woman who has navigated a fascinating journey from traditional cultural spaces into modern clinical settings. She's a licensed naturopathic doctor, acupuncturist, and psychotherapist who brings together multiple healing modalities in her approach to mental health. And her path is anything but conventional. From her early exposure to natural remedies through her 96-year-old grandfather from Possum Trot, Kentucky, to drinking ayahuasca in the basement of an ashram in Rishikesh, India, to shaving her head and following a Brazilian shaman who had become a Hindu guru, to eventually becoming clinical director at Field Trip Health's Los Angeles Ketamine Clinic. Her story offers unique insights into both the potential and pitfalls of integrating psychedelics into healthcare. What makes our conversation particularly valuable is how Dr. Kalstein bridges seemingly disparate worlds: psychoanalytic theory and somatic awareness, indigenous ceremony and clinical practice, individual therapy, and community healing. She challenges us to consider what might be lost when we medicalize psychedelics without considering the spiritual and communal contexts that traditionally surround them. I was especially struck by her reflections on what went wrong with the field trip model and her current work building a psychedelic community in Nashville, Tennessee. All right, that's it for now. Let's get into my conversation with Dr. Katelyn Kalstein. Katelyn, thank you for joining us for the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So I'd love to start with your grandfather, because this is very prominent in your bio. And I think from a lineage perspective, you mentioned that you were taught by your grandfather to use natural medicine. And I like how you mentioned this, and avoid doctors at an early age. Tell us a little bit about your grandfather, who he was, and you know what impact he had on
I love that you're starting there, and it's unexpected. So my grandfather is still alive. He's 96.
wow.
He's still kicking, literally and figuratively. He is the 13th child of 13. There were actually 15 siblings, and the last two, unfortunately, as it went back then, didn't make it to adulthood. So he is actually the last surviving of his 13 siblings. And he was born and raised in a really small town in Western Kentucky called Possum Trot. And they really used natural medicine because they didn't have any other options. But when the options became available later on in his life, he had kind of a foundational mistrust of the medical system, like for better or worse. There have definitely been times that we've urged him to seek medical care, and he's resistant to that. But yeah, growing up, it was just not part of my paradigm I don't know that I saw a doctor before I was in my 20s. It just was not part of our lifestyle. So we used natural remedies, we used food, we used sunshine a lot, getting outdoors. We used family connection. We used a lot of different things that were kind of just built into our world that we wouldn't even think of medicine, that now I have to prescribe to patients to do.
Like sunlight, getting
like
sunlight,
sunlight.
Is a prescription you will give,
right?
You will give people. Yeah, that sense of, I've seen more and more information about how exercise is as effective as antidepressants, and we know how important sunlight is, and it feels like, coming back to some of these roots, like your grandfather was rooted in the lineage that he was rooted in, and just what he needed and his family needed to do to survive. We're sort of coming back full circle into some of those practices. Now, you've had I would say, unconventional path in many ways, right? You spent time abroad in India, you spent time abroad in Brazil, and you specifically you were quite involved with Santo Daime. And we've talked about Santo Daime on the podcast a little bit here and there, but I'd love if you could bring us a little bit deeper into Santo Daime. What is the Santo Daime, and what drew you into that lineage or that practice with working with the Santo Daime?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start at the second part because it'll probably frame what I know about the church. And so when I was after college, I was pre med at Pepperdine. I wanted to be a doctor my whole life. I thought that that was a path I was going to go on, and I had a bit of a mental health crisis myself in my early years and throughout college. Found yoga and meditation as
Mm.
part of a self treating. Again, like I didn't have this paradigm of going to a doctor. Seeing a psychiatrist was not, even as someone who wanted to go into medicine, that was not something that ever entered my mind. So I treated myself through spiritual means, basically, found meditation, found yoga. Ended up traveling to India. I was supposed to be there for 2 months. I ended up there for a year. I met a
Wow.
spiritual teacher in India that was a Brazilian shaman who had a vision of an Indian guru that told him to come to India and that your path is leading you here and you're meant to be a Hindu guru, like a traditional in this lineage. So he traveled to Rishikesh and started his journey there. And I met him when I was traveling in Rishikesh and began studying with him pretty intently. And because he was formerly a shaman, I guess he was still a shaman, we used ayahuasca. So my first time
Mm.
doing ayahuasca was actually in the basement of an ashram at the banks of the Ganges River in Rishikesh, which was interesting. I had done, I had done psilocybin and LSD prior to that, so it wasn't my first time in an altered state. So that was helpful. But it definitely, I mean, it completely changed my life, and having that as part of a spiritual community and a practice. So that man became my guru. I was initiated into the lineage. I shaved my head. I changed my name. I fully went.
Shaved your head?
I did. I did.
Do you have
Um,
receipts?
I do.
You do? Oh, I
I
can't wait
do.
to. I would love to see those. It'd be
That's gonna be like the
fascinating.
thumbnail of this podcast is me with a shaved head.
Yeah,
Um,
Roshi
actually,
Katelyn Kalstein. Yeah, there we go.
right. I went by the name. I mean, I just fully threw myself. I mean, I think it also shows the identity crisis that I was going through. Now I understand what was happening in a much broader context. I needed a father figure. I was seeking desperately for leadership and for identity and to be part of a community and a tribe. And it answered all of those questions for me at the time. And so I began following him. I traveled him around the world. I went to Brazil many times. So for about 10 years, I went down to Brazil once or twice a year to study. And so he was initiated into the lineage of Santo Daime. So I came to Daime
Uh,
through him. And we had a very eclectic church. We it was very, I mean, Santo Daime in itself is a syncretic religion, meaning it brings together multiple pieces. It brings together the Catholicism of the time that Master Iranu, the leader, had a vision from the Queen of the Forest when he was on ayahuasca, saying that this medicine needed to be consecrated in the name of the Virgin Mary. He had this vision that this was very clear mission for him to integrate Christianity and the indigenous culture that was around ayahuasca at the time. And I mean, there's a lot more there in the history, but basically, the Santo Daime Church is a very structured church of ayahuasca. It's very different than some of the other forms that exist, like the Shipibo people of Peru, for example. We have ceremonies that we call works that last from 6 to 12 hours. We sing hinarios. It's very ritualized. It's very, very highly structured. And it's really seen as an integrated part of life for the people that are in this church.
Meaning they go to church. Like we would go to
They go
church every Sunday, maybe once a month. We would have communion. I grew up in the church, and this is how it was. But with the Santo Daime, it's like you go to church and you drink ayahuasca and you sing songs all night, if I'm not
You
mistaken.
sing songs, it's a family event. There are children present, there are babies present often. It's part of it, it is wrapped up in their community. So I mean, I think, I know we're going to get into this, but one of the things that we're trying to bridge in the psychedelic community today is inserting something like this into a medical model, which is fundamentally very different and very isolating and quite sterile. And so, yeah, a part of the religion of Santo Daime and the use of ayahuasca as its sacrament. The sacrament is just one piece, right? The community is a healing in itself. You would not do Santo Daime on your own, for example, unless you were a shaman training, perhaps.
Okay, so you go to India, you drink ayahuasca in the basement of an ashram,
Yep.
you shave your head and you follow a guru around for a decade. You end up in Brazil, you join the Santo Daime, and then you end up in Seattle in 2010. Tell us sort of about this transition from the sort of identity crisis that you were having and what you were going through into the choice to become a naturopathic physician, and why you made that choice. Why was that so essential
Yeah.
for your path?
Yeah. So like I said, I from a very early age, I wanted to be a doctor. I don't know where that came from. I knew I wanted to go that path, but I had a very different idea. Like I mentioned about my grandfather and my upbringing, I think I had a very different idea of what being a doctor meant. I thought I
Mm,
was going to be mixing potions and healing people, and
mm,
I went and worked for internist after I graduated from Pepperdine back here in Nashville, actually. And these were good doctors. They were good people. They had integrity. They were decent,
mhm,
and yet I was seeing pretty quickly that people weren't getting better
mm,
in their clinic. They were on more and more drugs. They were on higher doses of the same drug. Their files were getting thicker and thicker, and they weren't getting better. And something in me said this isn't right. Right? There's something that's missing. People aren't actually healing. They are maybe staving off like more severe pathology or disease for a little bit longer. They're staying alive longer, but they're not really healthy. They're not really thriving. And I had yet another crisis where I thought, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to
mm,
contribute to this problem. This isn't. I got very disillusioned with it all, and that's actually when I ended up leaving for India. So
mm.
this experience with Santo Daime and ayahuasca was kind of weaved in with all of this. And after about 11 months in India, I had the realization that I could not forsake this path of being a healer, that, I was born where I was for a reason. I actually went to India initially to study Ayurveda
Mm.
and then discovered that it was very hard for a white English speaking woman to study Ayurveda in schools that mostly were in Hindi. So,
Small detail.
I was wide eyed, and I really thought I'm going to go be an Ayurvedic doctor, and so that never left me. That desire to to be a physician, to be a teacher of medicine, to be a practitioner of medicine. And so it just so happened that I was in Hawaii. I met an acupuncturist who told me about naturopathic medicine. She was listening to my dilemma of how I still wanted to be in this world, but I couldn't foresee myself sitting in through 4 years of medical school where they said nutrition has no effect on your health. Where you didn't have 1 hour of nutritional training in 4 years of medical school, and I just knew I couldn't do that. And she said, "Well, what about naturopathic medicine?" And I had no idea what that was, and within 2 months, I
Oh,
was enrolled in a naturopathic doctorate program.
so totally new path, something you hadn't
Totally
really
new.
understood
Yeah,
or explored.
I had no idea that it existed. I mean, a lot of people still don't, like, naturopathic doctors are only licensed in 26 states.
Okay.
So, there's a huge gap in knowledge, of what naturopathic doctors do and what our training is. But for me at the time, it felt like the perfect fit. It was something that I was going to be able to learn about all of the drugs and the lab testing and how to refer. And naturopathic doctors are very well integrated in Seattle, where I studied. We're primary care physicians. We take insurance. We write prescriptions. So I had that ability, but then I also had the ability to spend a longer time with my patients, to spend about an hour with them, to talk to them about their mindset and how that might be affecting their health, their diet, their lifestyle, their relationships, their sexual life. I mean, all of these things that impact health that medical doctors weren't talking about.
And then in 2016, you ended up at 40 Years of Zen, which is, I think, an
Right.
interesting sort of term. We've had Dave Asprey on the podcast, I don't know, maybe about a year ago now. He came on. I've interviewed a couple other people about neurofeedback. I've done neurofeedback with our mutual colleague as well, Drew Pearson,
Mhm.
once. So I've done that work. What appealed to you about neurofeedback then as an approach and a modality? Why? You graduate, you're a naturopathic doctor, you're a primary care physician, yet you chose to go in as a lead facilitator for sort of this cutting edge biohacking modality. Why were you drawn to that? What appealed to you about that?
Well, I really didn't know much about neurofeedback. What appealed to me is Asprey said, you can teach mindfulness. And I said, great, that's exactly what I want to be doing. And he said, and you can give people IVs with NAD. And I was like, okay, this is it. Like he set up, he had this facility in Seattle that was brand new. I mean, I was the very first facilitator at 40 Years of Zen when we opened. And I just felt like it was an opportunity that I could not pass up more than anything. I did not seek it. I was recruited through someone, a mutual friend of Drew and I. And I thought, I'm an unconventional person. I was never going to go work in a clinic and just be a primary care doctor. I was always interested in more the mind-body connection, how I'm going to integrate all of the stuff that I'd been doing and studying in Santo Daime and meditation and yoga, and how I was going to integrate that into helping people live more healthy lives. So for me, it was more, Drew was the one doing the neurofeedback, and I learned a ton about it when I was there, and I had to know quite a bit. But really, my job was to lead them through the processing after they came out of these experiences, because you're not sitting in there getting passive neurofeedback. Part of 40 Years of Zen, they're actively in there engaging in emotional work. And so my job was to help guide that work and then process afterwards. And there were often times where we would have 3 hours or more debriefing sessions after their neurofeedback experience. So it was really group therapy.
And I'm curious, from a practitioner lens, I've talked a little bit about this on the podcast, but to go a little bit deeper, what were maybe some of the overlaps or commonalities that you noticed between people who were going through something like, 40 Years of Zen, intense, I believe it was 4 to 5 days of intense neurofeedback, versus working with ayahuasca or, sitting with psychedelics? Kind of what did you notice as maybe some commonalities, but also what are maybe some of the differences in terms of what people were going through or observing or noticing?
I think that's a good question, because we can induce quote unquote altered states. We can induce that through a variety of means. Neurofeedback could be one of them. It's not as reliable as ayahuasca.
Right.
If you take a certain dose, you're probably going to feel altered. Whereas neurofeedback, I feel there's a lot more of an opportunity for defenses or the ego or whatever you want to call it to kind of get in the way and still be in the driver's seat. So it took a bit more of openness and surrender for people to really make use of that week. And what I noticed after being there for about a year, putting together my observations over that year, was that, people who had not done any type of work before coming to 40 Years of Zen were probably unlikely to get a ton out of it. Like there needed to be, and I feel that about the ketamine work that I do, there needs to be a little bit of a foundation, at least in mindfulness and, at the very minimum, to be able to really make the most use of these tools that we have.
And I think maybe the difference then is neurofeedback. If someone doesn't come in with that, it's unlikely neurofeedback will move the needle.
Well, it depends on what you're trying to
substantive effect.
Sure, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're looking for, if you're looking to have a mystical experience, certainly,
right,
it's going to be more difficult to have with neurofeedback versus ayahuasca. It's apples to oranges. However, neurofeedback is a modality that's used for ADHD and for attention issues and for anxiety and for a lot of other. So it depends on what we're treating, and I think that's really important to meet the person to understand what it is we're actually trying to do and what the mission is.
Yeah, I when I went through neurofeedback, this was just over 3 years ago now. I felt like it was more of a fine tuning.
Yeah.
I sort of thought of myself as an instrument, and when we were going into these deep spaces, I was tuning and attuning to the different states of brain waves, whether it's delta or alpha or theta or whatever it might be. So I could sort of notice moving in and out with more ease, like more awareness. Whereas with psychedelic, it's just like it kind of hits you. And it can be a bit harder to direct it or navigate it, especially if you're quite new to psychedelics. I think as we get more experience, we sort of have I call it the skill of psychedelics. We have a better sense of, okay, if I drink 1 cup of ayahuasca, or I take 100 micrograms of LSD, or if I do, a microdose of psilocybin mushrooms, it's going to affect me in this way or that way. But at the beginning, it's a lot of trial and error. And I think the great thing about neurofeedback is when you have a great technician, and I think Drew is a really great technician, that potential risk is really mitigated compared to, just having someone go and drink 2 cups of ayahuasca in the jungle or whatever that might be.
Yeah, and they're going to feel something, right? With neurofeedback, I think you probably did a lot of work before you went into that and had a lot of self-awareness of your states. And that is what's missing, I think, is some really foundational basic work of knowing yourself, knowing because you could subjectively feel when you were in alpha versus when you weren't, for example. Right. And that is even a skill that I think we take for granted, and how much work it took to even develop that sensory awareness. And I think in the psychedelic world in general, psychedelics are having to do a lot of heavy lifting because we don't have a good foundation. And so we're relying on them maybe a little too much to do the work that, my grandfather innately did because he had to,
Right. Yeah, I could go into this whole thread about de-domestication and how, convenience and consumerism has made us soft and coddled and easy.
That's a thing now, right? Like with this I see and I hope that psychedelic medicine is ushering in a completely new paradigm.
Right.
And it's a paradigm that's going to have to integrate spirituality. We're going to have spirit back in medicine. And we're going to have to figure out how to do that because we've lost a lot of elders in that world, and we don't have mentorship like we should, and we don't have supervision like we should. And if not, we're going to end up with the same model that we currently have, which is take a pill for this thing, and you don't have to do anything else.
Right. And
the pill is going to have psilocybin instead of Prozac, but it's the same model.
Right. My argument would be it would still be an incremental improvement, but we don't need incremental improvements at this point in time. We need exponential improvements, right? And so there is this question of not how do we do incrementally better, which I think is unfortunately what medicine is incentivized to do, is to do incrementally better. But instead to go, okay, what is the new paradigm that can be introduced? Ideally, that has connection at the center of it. And that's even why I asked about, and I think what's so interesting about your experience with Santo Daime and ayahuasca is the center point of that is community.
Yeah.
And a lot of the medical models that we're currently looking at in terms of FDA approval don't really put that at the center, right? That's sort of an afterthought because the FDA system doesn't incentivize for that. It incentivizes for a sort of very individual one-to-one approach, if you will.
Right. And that's why, that's what we saw with the FDA decision this summer, was that they can't regulate therapy. And that's really why MDMA, there were a lot of other reasons that they gave as to why they didn't approve it. But a large part was, hey, we can't regulate this. And this is an essential part of the model. And this is an essential part of the treatment.
And you navigated that head on. So we're going to jump ahead a couple years. So you were at 40 Years of Zen, but then you became the clinical director at Field Trip Health in Los Angeles. And a lot of our listeners may know of Field Trip. If not, Field Trip was a publicly traded company. They had several ketamine clinics around the United States and Canada, and they raised a lot of money. They had incredibly beautiful centers, but the model was not sustainable. And the clinic side of the company went bankrupt. They spun off a new entity called Reunion Neuroscience, which has now raised money and is bringing, I think, FT104 through clinical trials or something like that. But the actual clinical model of serving ketamine in really beautiful spaces did not work out. And you were sort of at the center point of that because you were the clinical director in LA. I imagine LA was one of, if not the biggest clinic because of its location and being on the West Coast, and people were more open to psychedelics there. What attracted you about that role and that position? I feel like I've asked you this about like 4 things now, but I keep having to ask you because your career is so interesting. So what drew you to that role, and how was the reality of the role different than what your expectation maybe was of the role?
So at the time I was recruited by Field Trip, and I was working in a primary care clinic, setting up a ketamine arm of the primary care clinic with Dr. Gary Schliffer, who's in Woodland Hills at Evolve Healthcare, fantastic physician. So I was in private practice. I had studied with Phil Wolfson. I was in the first ever cohort, actually, of Phil's training in January of 2018 at the Ketamine Training Institute, which is now the Ketamine Training Center. So a lot of those people that were in my group have gone on to start different ketamine training themselves, like Polaris, for example. So I was in that group with Dr. Wolfson and Julaine and Jen Dorr, and I fell in love with the model and how we could integrate. I could bring in all of this spirituality, all of this meditation that I've been doing in my personal life, which at that point I had not found a way really to bring that into my professional practice. I was doing integrative mental health, but nothing with psychedelics, certainly. And so I started using ketamine in private practice and was in private practice for maybe 3 years before I started, before I was recruited by Field Trip. So, I mean, Field Trip was a dream. It was a dream, like, to be in this space. As you said, they had these really beautiful, luxurious, kind of med spa feeling spaces that you walked in and immediately kind of your nervous system was calm. And it was beautiful and huge spaces. And yeah, LA was the flagship location. So it was supposed to be the golden child, if you will, of Field Trip. And by the time when I started, there were 4 Field Trip clinics. And by the time I left, I think they had 12 leases and they were opening 12 clinics, which we know how that went. But it's the dream. I mean, it was a multidisciplinary team. It was, so I was the director over physicians, psychiatrists, nurses, therapists. I mean, it was exactly what an integrative model should or could look like, of having all of these people with expertise in psychology and biology and using the best of what we currently have, medicine, to treat really hard to treat mental health conditions. So yeah, it was, I mean, we talked offline about this before, but for me, it felt like it was a wonderful opportunity. I'm incredibly glad and grateful that I did it and that I met the people that I did. And it felt really like an exercise in what not to do, more than anything.
Why was that?
It was, the communication was not great from the leadership down. It was a team that got built very, very fast. I think probably too quickly. They expanded too quickly without sufficient leadership in place. And there was a lot of differences in opinion of how things should be done. So the clinicians that were actually seeing the patients in the clinic had ideas of what should be done and how it should be done. And then the people that were in the boardroom that weren't actually maybe clinicians, maybe 1 or 2 of them were, had a different idea of how things should be done. And I think this is an ongoing, like, I don't have a solution to this. I actually don't have a solution to how Field Trip could have done it better. Well, a couple of things. But I think this is something that we're going to have to probably painfully work in and out of as we're developing these clinics and these models. Is one, how to make it accessible, how to make it affordable, how to make sure that we're taking care of our clinicians and our patients and our investors all at the same time. It's tricky.
Well, I think part of the challenge with Field Trip is they were using generic ketamine and not necessarily Spravato. And
Correct.
And generic ketamine at that point in time, there wasn't a lot of work that had been done to figure out how it could be covered by health insurance. I think I now know several clinics that use generic ketamine and have figured out how to take health insurance for it. But I think because Field Trip was a first mover, they didn't have the time to really figure that out, which made it very difficult to be able to fill up the clientele that they needed. So I think health insurance is a big one. And obviously we know in the United States it's a very sort of convoluted system and a very difficult system. And then the second one is, what is this balance between efficiency and healing, right? That the quicker you can move clients in and out, the more money you can make, which I think is what's attractive about this Spravato model. It's a 45-minute to an hour session. Johnson & Johnson gets reimbursed through health insurance for that Spravato. You have to be in clinic. But how effective is it really at treating the root cause of what someone is going through? Probably not that effective, because they don't really have the space and the time to really flesh it out. And I think that's what speaks to even the training that you did with Phil Wolfson and what we learn in psychedelic assisted therapy models is it's not necessarily the drug that is the end all be all. but it's both the drug and the support, of a human being and a community around you.
Right. And it's the container. And that's the problem is you have to pay for that therapist's time. But I mean, you're right. The insurance model, and I'm not aware of these, of people who are able to get ketamine, which is still off label for all mental health conditions, racemic ketamine. That's not Spravato. I'm not aware of how to get that covered, but you can get therapist time covered through super billing, and that you can get insurance to pay for the therapy side of things, but not the ketamine. But the thing about that is ketamine is dirt cheap. I mean,
Right,
it's $1 a dose.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
super cheap, right?
Yeah. So that's not the issue is the time. Yeah.
Right. The time, and I think that's why I love, these models of group and community,
Yes.
because when we think of time, we think it has to be one-on-one, and it could be that for very intractable cases, people who have complex PTSD, people who have, who are alcoholics, deep trauma, the one-to-one work is necessary, but the vast majority of people, they could benefit from these group experiences and being supported and loved by a community of other humans.
Absolutely. I mean, that goes back to what are we treating? I mean, a lot of times, like
Right.
depression, it's there's symptoms of depression, is what we say, right? This person has symptoms of depression. I think depression is a symptom of something else, and that's where we're missing it. We're treating the symptoms rather than treating the cause, which is a principle of naturopathic medicine that functional doctors have now picked up from us. But it's common sense. Like treat what's actually the problem. And I think the group model is probably the future because it is treating what the issue is, which is in a lot of cases loneliness and lack of community and lack of purpose and lack of meaning because of loneliness. So I think groups are, we're doing a group next weekend. I know a lot of actually clinicians in Nashville that run groups for ketamine groups, and this is pretty common.
Really?
So
In Nashville?
in Nashville. I know. There's a growing community here.
That was going to be my next question for you, because you lived on the West Coast for some time. You traveled extensively as well, and you recently moved back to Nashville. What's it like to be in Tennessee and be into psychedelics? Like, it feels like it'd be a little edgy, there.
Yeah, I mean, we find our bubble everywhere, right? So, I mean,
Right.
I have my little bubble of doctors, and I mean, one of my best friends here is a cardiologist who is super supportive, and endocrinology and internal medicine doctors and psychiatrists. It's a small group, it's a small group, but they're here, and the people really want it. The people are here, the demand is here. They just don't know about it. I mean, I think that's the main thing is education. And once you explain it to them, I mean, patients are completely not all of them. Of course, I get, a selection bias of who comes to see me, obviously, but the community is here. It's growing. People are interested. I think this is happening everywhere. But there is something really special about this being my hometown and coming back and being able to kind of offer this medicine and bring kind of, like you said, like all my travels around the world back here, that there's something about that feels really full circle and really beautiful.
What are maybe some of your hopes or intentions, maybe over the next year, 3 years, or 5 years? Like, how would you like to help steward this or contribute to it or be a part of it locally? Like, what sort of plans are you putting into place?
I mean, I think building the community is what I'm doing right now and that takes time. I think that one thing that I'm, I guess, concerned about, I don't know, is the speed with which people are moving in a way. And in some ways it's taken forever. It's been decades and
forever, right? Yeah,
it's happened forever. It's been taking, but at the same time, it's like, the community is building really fast. So I think we need to be intentional about slowing down in some ways. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm putting a group of people around me, building a team of people that I think is going to lead to something really beautiful, community experience. And so, I mean, my personal dream would be to have a clinic where I could bridge all of this, where we have time to spend with people. If a person needs thyroid hormone to treat their depression, that's what they get. Not everyone needs ketamine to treat their depression. Some people, some people need the sun. Some people need to do psychoanalysis. They need to be in therapy. Some people need to leave their marriage. Some people there's a lot of different things. And that only can come with relationships and building relationships, knowing people, how to do assessments, training. So I think 3 to 5 years, building community in Nashville. We'll see what that ends up looking like, whether that's a brick and mortar thing or not. And continuing to hone my craft. Like, I mean, I think now in terms of years as far as training goes. And I think that that's where we need to be looking in terms of decades of mastery. And eventually I'd love to be supervising this work and training other people.
That was going to be my next question. Like, what is your craft? We have a lot of practitioners who listen to this podcast. I would say that's the vast majority of people who tune into this podcast. They're practitioners. They have professional interests in psychedelics. They're actively doing work. And so I always love when practitioners come on the podcast to ask them, like, how do you work with clients? Like, what is sort of your unique approach? What are you weaving in? And obviously that will slightly differ depending on the client and where they're at. But what are sort of your core tools that you lean on as part of your practice?
Well, I mean, I'm a generalist. I'm a therapist. I'm a naturopathic doctor. I listen for what is this person really asking for, and what do they really need? And that could be they're not sleeping. If someone is not sleeping, they have like a 70% chance, it's an insane number, of having some type of mental health symptom, right?
Mm.
Whether it's anxiety or symptoms of depression. So I'm listening for that. Is it a sleep thing? Like, where do we need to start? Is it sleep? Is it relationships? Is it biology? Is it psychic? And a lot of times the answer is like, we need to do work on their childhood. They have complex trauma. They have that's the majority of my clientele for sure. And so for the psychic route, I do a lot of psychodynamic psychotherapy, like psychoanalytic, Freud, Jung, Anna Freud, Winnicott, those people. I actually think that there's going to be, I'm in the process of writing an article right now on psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory and psychedelics. I think that anyone who does psychedelic coaching or training needs some education in Freudian concepts, the unconscious, dream work. We need to know how the mind works. You need to have a theory of mind if you're going to work with someone's mind. I mean, it's pretty basic, but like, how are you framing everything that's coming out of their mouth? Are you hearing it as a projection? Are you hearing it as fact? Are you hearing it as their opinion? I mean, there's so many things there. So, I mean, I guess the answer is I work in a lot of different ways depending on the person in front of me. I practice personalized medicine.
Yeah, well, I'm curious in the psychoanalysis part. One of our faculty, we have a practitioner training program where we train coaches. We have some clinicians who come in as well, but the emphasis is on what I call the betterment of well-being. And so we have a lot of faculty who are both clinically trained, but also now do executive coaching as sort of the focus. And so we have one faculty who is a psychoanalyst and, has his PhD in psychoanalysis and has worked as a psychotherapist for many years and now does executive coaching. And he does a lesson, sort of a session on transference and countertransference is a core one that we teach because of the suggestibility that is present in psychedelics, because of the power dynamics that can come up, et cetera, et cetera. So that just to me is sort of a curiosity. Like, when I think of psychedelics, I think of, and you mentioned this in your about section as well, gestalt and somatic and whatnot. So what role, let's go a little bit deeper into the psychoanalysis part. Why do you think that is so important? Even though a lot of the experiences that people have with psychedelics tend to be very embodied and transpersonal and, kind of out of the mind, if you will.
Yeah, out of the mind, but how are we interpreting it? Right. So like everything goes through the mind at some point. So you'll have this somatic experience, right? And then how are you interpreting that? How are you making meaning of that? Then what? I think the somatic has definitely been left behind. And I'm really glad that there's a resurgence of like somatic experiencing, which I did the first year of the SE training. And there are other therapists in my practice who specialize in that. And that's just not that's not where my energy is. But and yet I'm a very somatic person. So like, if I'm going to integrate from a psychedelic experience, I'm going to go to ecstatic dance. I'm not going to sit and journal for 3 hours. Like, I'm going to move. I'm going to have music on. I'm going to do yoga. I'm going to do something somatically oriented. But ultimately we're interpreting that then through our mind. And so like, how do we make meaning of that? And I think that a lot of the outcomes that are published, in psychedelic studies talk about how people are better because they were able to like see something differently. They were able to have an insight. They were able to interpret something differently. This problem that I thought was this way, I saw it bigger. I saw it from the 40,000 foot view, and it's not really a problem at all. It's an invitation. Life is asking me to do something different. All of those things, our suffering in general can kind of come down to how we're interpreting reality. So if you don't have an idea of how the mind does that, I don't know how you're practicing psychedelic medicine or therapy. Like if a therapist is listening to this, we have to be able to study and look at how the mind makes meaning of things, how it interprets things, the subjective lens through which it interprets absolutely everything. So that's what I mean when I say psychoanalytic theory. I think people really don't understand how pervasive it is in pretty much our entire culture. I mean, anytime you say ego, like that came from psychoanalytic theory. There's older text talking about the ego in the sense of the identity, in the sense of self. But it's very pervasive in looking at your dreams and all of that. That work, it's not attributed often to psychoanalysis. People don't talk about it as much, but a lot of the way that therapists work, I think, is rooted in psychoanalysis, and they don't even know it.
How do you think about the role of a healthy ego? There's a lot of conversation in the psychedelic space around ego dissolution and ego death and, get through the ego and everything. What's your take on sort of the ego and how we can have sort of a healthy present ego?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. And also one thing is, the inflation of the ego on psychedelics after psychedelics and this kind of Dunning-Kruger effect that happens in people who take psychedelics once and feel very empowered, which is a very real feeling and a very common feeling. But then they take that as, now I'm going to be a shaman. Like now I've had this powerful experience, and now the medicine told me I'm supposed to be a leader in this, and that's an interpretation, right? So again, like understanding how we're interpreting things and through which frame is really important. So the ego, this whole idea of ego death, and some people kind of grab onto this and go kind of crazy with it. That's the point of a psychedelic experience, is to have ego dissolution. That can certainly be an experience. I've had that as an experience. It can also do a lot of harm, which I know that you know. I don't see ego death as the point. I think that ego death can be a part of the experience and needs to be integrated. I don't see the ego as a bad thing. And I think that the healthy ego structure is kind of rare these days to have that. So according to psychoanalysis and developmental theory, the ego develops sometime around 18 months and is pretty much present into the second year of life. So that's around the time a 2-year-old will say mine, my, me. They know that they're distinct from the mother, from the father. They know that they're a separate self. It's this idea of, I have a separate entity that is separate from Paul. That if there is a developmental interruption during that time, like the 18 months mark around then, which I had personally, you can see the ego is weakened. There's some disruption in development. There's a disruption in the sense of self. And how this walks into your clinic as an adult is low self-esteem, feeling foundationally like I'm not enough, even though they can't really point to a cause of where that came from. It feels very nebulous. It sounds very much like complex trauma. I just don't know. I just kind of feel empty, or I don't feel good enough, or low self-esteem, low confidence. It can show up like that. And the reason why it shows up kind of as this somatic experience, or just this felt sense of truth without a direct line to, they can say, oh, this trauma happened, is because it happened pre-verbally. And so if we don't get the attunement and the structure that we need in those early years of development, it can be hard to build a healthy ego and a strong ego. And I think in my case, I had no business doing ayahuasca when I did it, because I did not have a healthy ego structure. And it took me many years to integrate some of the really challenging early experiences that I had because of that.
Okay, this is sort of an interesting reflection, would you say you regret drinking ayahuasca that early? Would you say it was all meant to be and I'm glad it happened that way? Would you say it was traumatic to some degree? Like, kind of bring me into the nuance of that reflection a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it would be impossible for me to say I wish I hadn't done that because I'm here now and everything. I'm grateful for
Seem to be
everything,
all
right?
right.
Yeah, I seem to be fine. That's all relative. But I think that I think that I went through. Look, I don't think that our job is to like avoid suffering at all cost. I think that crisis can be supported. It shouldn't always be avoided. I think crisis is something, the dark night of the soul, like these experiences that we have to somehow wake up to the shadow, like another psychoanalytic term that people don't give credit to where it came from. But this notion of like these things that we need to go through and challenges that we need to experience. I think this is a problem with the current generation. They feel like they should never experience any negative valence or negative experience. So I wouldn't say that I shouldn't have gone through that. I think the road was pretty bumpy, and I wonder if it didn't have to be so bumpy with the right support and in the right container. But no, I wouldn't have. I mean, there's still works that I am processing now 12 years later. Like, for sure. And I think that if I had not had the foundation I had in meditation and in yoga and in a supportive family and in relatively, adequate resources to seek help and whatnot, I don't know where I would have been.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that reflection. It sounds like you had the capacity to fall apart because at the end of the day, you did have, and for me, it's like this, it's the family support, it is the resources, it's at least some semblance of a reasonably good childhood, right? Where you kind of have that sort of infrastructure that's underneath the conscious mind that you can lean into, which allows you to go through these moments or these months of transformation, even when they are really difficult. Yeah. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we face is how do we hold people through experiences like this, through a dark night of the soul or through some process of transformation, because we are not well equipped. And I think it's partly what we're trying to retrieve from indigenous wisdom, if you will, is what are the containers that can be created to hold people as they navigate the sort of unveiling of their true self. If
For sure. And it can't be on one person. I mean, we know the burnout rates, of therapists nowadays are insane. Even the burnout rates in physicians are crazy, like 50% in 2023 reported burnout. One person cannot be your support. Like one therapist cannot be the support system. And unfortunately for too many of my clients that it should be, I am their own, what they would say is their only support. And that's what we're working on. So it's like, what's my treatment for them? Go find support. That's the treatment.
And this is where the lack of religion and people leaving the church, I think, is problematic, because as we talked about, we're looking at how we can weave spirit back into medicine, and the spiritual life tended to be churches, and we no longer have that because churches haven't been able to adapt like we wish they would. But I think that's also an opportunity in the psychedelic space is, what are these new syncretic churches? And so when I'm just going to make a sort of probably both a projection and prediction here, but my sort of reflection on you is that you're always like at the cutting edge of something. So you were like in Santo Daime super early, and then you did 40 Years of Zen, and then you were at Field Trip. And I feel like, I don't know, I just sense some sort of psychedelic church is in your future, right? Like some aspect or element of that. I don't know what that will look like. I don't know what that will be, but I want to come to the service when it happens. So please invite me. Okay.
Awesome. Well, it will be one of community. We're not going to have any guru.
Right. And I think it is about the Sangha, right? And I think that's it's part of the shift now that we're trying to understand is how do we decentralize authority within these religious environments?
Absolutely. That's it.
Make it more mycelial.
Right.
Learn from the mushroom. All right. Wow. So we've covered a lot. There's been a lot that we've been able to explore. These hours or 50 minutes always feel too short. I do feel compelled to ask you one more question, which is, I guess, what is it meant to have a child, to move back to Nashville, to be rooted sort of in the sort of family environment that you grew up in? Again, like, what has that meant to your path? What has that meant to even your development? What has that meant to you as just feeling, I guess, more grounded and rooted and centered in who you are?
Well, that's a generous assumption. That I'm more grounded and rooted. No, I do feel that way. You know, I've been, so the first time I took psilocybin was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And that woke me up to a completely different reality. And I always felt very much like I didn't belong here. That in here could be Nashville, and here could be this planet at times. And now that I'm back, it's really interesting to see how it came full circle. And really the thing that strikes me more than anything, and I'm in my own psychoanalysis right now with an analyst. So that's been really, okay. So I've done a lot of different things. I've done, decades of psychedelic work, been in a psychedelic church, done stuff on my own, somatic experiencing, yoga. I mean, I'm not naming like 50 other modalities that I've tried. And by far, psychoanalysis has been the most quick and profound, which, like, if people are listening, they're like, psychoanalysis is quick because historically and famously, you're in analysis for like 10 years,
right?
Like minimum. But it's allowed me to see these different structures that I talked about that really lay the framework for how you view the world very, very early on, and that are pre-verbal. And so I think there's been something very symbolic about being back in Nashville, doing this work while still working on daddy issues. Like still, and sometimes you can, and for people listening that are feeling this way, I'm with you. Like, you're like, I've been doing this for 15 years. How am I still fucking up? And it's like, because you're still alive. That's the answer. Because you're alive, because it's a process. There is no end. There is no, we're done. Like, we're done when we're dead. And even then we're not done. So I'm humbled by the work. I no longer feel like I need to be somewhere I'm not. And I think that feels really good, to be okay where I am and know that I'm still working on childhood stuff, and I've been working on it for 20 years, and that's okay. So yeah, thank you for saying that I'm grounded, and I do feel more grounded than ever, and it's a work in progress.
Beautiful. Well, yeah. Katelyn, thank you for joining us and sharing so much of your light and your wisdom and love. We appreciate your presence on the podcast, and drop it in for a little bit. If folks want to learn more about your work, you're on Instagram.
I am.
You post,
Dr. Kalstein.
You post here and there. You also have a website, I believe.
Yep, drkalstein.com. It's pretty easy to find me.
Any other places? Do you have a book coming out? Do you have a church announcement? Like anything?
It's been seeded. It's been seeded. No church announcement. No, okay. I mean, I'm talking to people every day who are interested in creating more spaces in Nashville. But right now I'm really enjoying my private practice and my group practice. I'm with 6 other therapists here in Nashville at a brick and mortar place, and called Simply Being Therapy. And I'm loving the camaraderie of that and having those amazing women to practice alongside. And right now that is my mission, and I love it. That's what I'm doing.
Beautiful. Simply Being Therapy. Thank you. Yep. Thank you, Katelyn, for joining us for the podcast, and folks, go check out her work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thanks so much for watching. If you want to grow your own medicine from microdosing or high dose experiences, check out our Mushroom Grow Kit. It's the simplest way to get a reliable source of high quality mushrooms, and it includes detailed videos walking you through the entire process. No guessing, just clear instructions for best results. Check out the link in the description below.